All right, now let's look at active transport. What is active transport? So two things that's really important about active transport. Number one, it is a form of transport that goes against the concentration gradient. What does that mean? It goes from a concentration of low to high. So that's number one. That's really important about active transport. Number two, it requires ATP. ATP is required for this actual procedure. Okay? So now we're going to talk about the different types of active transport. Okay? So the first thing we have, it's called primary active transport. So we're going to put primary here. What are some examples of these primary active transport? So what's really important about primary active transport, I'll put a here just so we don't get confused. Primary active transport is that it is a pump that requires ATP to push everything against the gradient, right? So an example of primary active transport, this primary active transport uses ATP directly. So ATP is used here directly in these specific pumps. So for a perfect example of these primary active transports are the ATPases. The ATPases, the exchange ATPases, where the ATP is directly used in order to allow for certain ions to go against the specific gradient. Now, we have secondary active transport, or another way for it, it's called indirect ATP. All right? So secondary active transport. Okay, so this is indirect. What does that mean? It means ATP does not directly bind to these channels, right? Whether it's not necessarily actually ATP, but it's the electrochemical gradient that is created from the concentration. So now, what's really important about these is there's two specific kinds of these secondary active transports. There are the symports. So what does sim mean? Symport means two or more molecules that go in the same direction. So symport channels. And the second is going to be antiport channels. So antiport, what does anti mean? It means opposite. So there's a sort of an exchange here. So again, remember the two main differences. So primary active transport directly uses ATP going against the gradient, whereas secondary active transport is indirectly related to ATP. Rather, it's more related to the concentration gradient of the other solute. All right? And then the last type of transport are the form of cytosis. Okay, so there's endo and exocytosis. So when we look at endo, what does endo mean? Endo means coming inside. So this is cells taking in these microvesicles from the outside. So the phagocytes or macrophages are a perfect example of the process of endocytosis. They do it through two processes: phagocytosis, which is what? It's cell eating, and also pinocytosis, which is cell drinking. All right? And then finally, so you have endo. So this is all the stuff is coming into the cell. What about leaving the cell? What do you think that's called? Exocytosis. So again, this is a form of, we call bulk flow. Cytosis. This is an example of bulk flow, meaning that there is a complete movement of back and forth against the specific gradient presented here. So these are the different types of active transport.